Treasures of Herat is about two manuscripts of the Khamsah of Nizami in the British Library. The Khamsah is the Quintet of 5 books written by the great Persian poet Nizami, who was alive in what Westerners would call the 12th century. So we have these two, and I've put their numbers down below because that's the easiest way of referring to them individually. There are a lot of things that one can say about these manuscripts, but for the moment I want to concentrate on the question of which artists might have painted which pictures. So it won't be that only, but mainly on that. This is a rather old-fashioned way of looking at manuscripts, perhaps, but I think that we owe it to the painters of the time. And also it makes a good way of concentrating the mind to look at these things. So these were made in Herat when it was under Timurid rule, the majority of the illustrations come in the 1490s, but that isn't the end or the beginning of the history of these manuscripts. So here is edition 25900, and it starts with this wonderful double page. This is just the right-hand side of illumination, where we see some shapes which are typical of Herat work, with the intersecting arcs of circles guiding the design. So that you can see it in a bit more detail, here's a detail, and you can see how very, very finely it's drawn. So this sort of work can deserve a great deal of time and attention. Now, this is probably datable to the 1440s, because we have this one date in the manuscript, which gives us in the Islamic calendar 846, which gives us in the Western calendar 1442. However, this is not the end of the story, because this date is on the end of the first book, and there are 5 books, so even at the very least there's more copying to come after this. And much more interventions happen. So below now you see the beginning of that colophon, and you see a bit of text set on an angle, and that's ornamented by a couple of triangles of illumination, and these are less finely drawn than the piece above, so that's a different date. Probably quite late, but not easy to be sure. And beside it there's a bit of gold work, which might have come in at any time from, roughly speaking, 90 years after the 1440s, and then for some decades afterwards. It's difficult to be sure about that as well. Now, the manuscript starts with what has been considered a double frontispiece. So on the right we have the prince and the princess being entertained by a great number of ladies, and on the left we have this marvellous picture of people preparing food in a courtyard. And the picture's had a bit of damage, so that's not exactly as it was meant to look. There's a print-off of blue paint over somebody's head, for example. But you can still see some wonderful details, and for example at the foot of the big tree, near the elbow of the man in light blue, there's a large bowl, and it's evidently been glazed with a lead glaze, because the colour of the glaze is a slightly yellowish green, an olive green, and you can see runnels of glaze going down the side of the bowl. Right, so now this is not a frontispiece. It wasn't meant to be a frontispiece, because on the right-hand side there is a section of gold at the top right, and that is fairly clearly blanking out a space that was meant to be for text, and you don't have text in a frontispiece. So that page has been brought in from another part of the manuscript. Here's a detail from the area I think it was taken from. If you look at this, you can see again sections of text on an angle, and some of them have what would appear to be a little sort of palish corner, top and bottom, but in the lowest third row, they don't have these. And that's because in the third row, the text was meant to be set on angles, whereas in the upper two rows there, the text has been cut and set on an angle, and that's because somebody wanted to waste space. They wanted to lose a lot of space, and they wanted to lose it because this is the area the picture's been taken from. This is the other side of that folio, and here we have a subheading which says it is Khosrow sitting together with Shireen while the girls tell stories. So that's pretty conclusively where that picture comes from. Here's the picture again. Now, here are the prince and the princess in detail. They're Khosrow and Shireen. This is a moment early in their love story, and the night is beautiful, full of perfumes. There is drink and poetry and so on. The figures are slim, elegant. The lady has a speaking gesture, but they have a quality which I have been calling fragile. That's how they seem to me. They have a certain tenseness in them. And that's one of the reasons I associate them with a painter by the name of Shah Muzaffar. He was quite important because his father had been the top of the library in the previous reign, and unfortunate Shah Muzaffar didn't live very long. He died in his 24th year, which seems to me to go well with the idea of fragility, but I may, of course, be over-interpreting. Here is another picture which I would attribute to him, and this is an important picture. It's again in the story of Khosrow and Shireen. They've been together, they've quarrelled. Khosrow has gone on a hunting expedition, pretending he's just going hunting, but in fact he's gone running off to Shireen's castle and is asking if he can be let in. So he's down in the bottom right. This picture's important because it takes up more space than a lot of the others, and up at the top it gives the date, which you can see in Persian Arabic notation 895, which gives us 1490. So this is the date of this and the majority of the illustrations, so 50 years after the copying. Here is the window at the top with the ladies in it. This is a little bit puzzling because the text actually says that Shireen puts on a red garment and goes up to the roof. And here we've got three ladies, and only one of them's wearing a little bit of red. She is perhaps Shireen, but she looks rather as though she is going to throw down a sort of bomb of scent upon Khosrow, who's arriving over carpets she's had laid out. Also in the window, there's somebody who appears to be restraining her, and there is a lady who herself looks rather lovelorn, wearing green. So it's a more complicated setup than the text allows for. Nevertheless, I think it's by that same painter who, as I say, I'm assuming it's Shah Muzaffar. Here's another picture which I would attribute to him. And again, we've got the very strong vertical emphasis. Here we're in a different story, the story of Layla and Majnun, the children from different Arab tribes who fall in love at school and are not allowed to marry. Majnun, his birth was called Qais, goes mad for love, and that's why he's called Majnun, the one who's been got at by the jinn, Jinn. His father takes him to the Kaaba in Mecca in the hope that this will cure him. But Majnun simply clings to the door of the Kaaba and prays that his love will continue. Again, we have these figures that I would characterize as fragile. They're beautifully drawn, they're eloquent, but they look sort of thin, almost as though they were beggars, but they're not specifically meant to be thin. They're just ordinary pilgrims. There's a difference in one of the faces in the bottom row towards the left, the one who is facing nearly out towards us. The face has been worked over in India. So that's another layer of the history of the manuscript. Here we come to another painter, I believe, and everyone has believed this, I think. It has an attribution to the painter Behzad, written vertically in the text area below the picture. And I think it convincingly is by this great painter. The story here is that we are with Bahram Gur, a real ruler of Iran, who, at least in the story, is a great hunter. And here in his youth, he's pursuing the wild ass, the onager, and he follows a particularly beautiful female specimen, and she leads him to the lair of a dragon. So a dragon's a more interesting quarry than an onager. So he attacks the dragon, kills it, cuts it open, and inside is the foal of the onager still intact. So we have this wonderful picture of the dragon in his protective colouring, which matches his rocky situation, but he's a real dragon because of the little spurt of gold flame coming out of his mouth. And he's coming crawly down this tree, and one has somehow the sort of feeling that there's a great deal further length of dragon that you're not actually seeing. And we also have the young prince riding towards him, very eager, on a horse which is clearly alarmed but is willing to go with its rider. Here we are. Now, here we have, again, detail of Bahram Gur, and you can see the interesting fact that we don't see the string of his bow at all. I think that's because it's absolutely too fine to draw. You can see the horse's noseband is practically a line, so if you reduce that to the size of a bowstring, comparatively speaking, there's practically nothing left. I'm matching it with the picture of Khosrow from the previous picture to try and say that these seem to me very definitely by different painters. They are, of course, in different situations. Khosrow is not in sort of urgent action, but he doesn't, to me, have anything like even the potential energy that you have in Behzad's Bahram Gur. Here is another picture, again I think attributable to Behzad. We have a young man, Mahan, who has gone on, I think, basically a merchant's trip, but he gets sort of finds himself landed in a desert. Everything goes wrong. He's not doing what's quite right. He is riding along in this desert, wondering how he's going to get out of it, and suddenly his way is blocked by a rather large number of demons. And if that isn't bad enough, suddenly his horse develops dragon heads. So you have this marvelous picture of the young man leaning back. He's in terror, but there's an element of comedy about it. His toes are spread in terror. He's leaning back on his horse, looking sort of gobsmacked is the word that comes to mind. And even as he leans back, he isn't taking notice of the fact that the horse's tail has gone serpentine, so you wouldn't want to lean too far back on it either. Now, the demons are on the model of this creature, which is one of a number of pictures found in albums, chiefly in the Topkapı Saray in Istanbul, and they're subject of great debate, but probably of the 14th century. Anyway, this is a sort of model for demons, and it penetrates in many paintings. In our particular painting, we have these sort of creatures, and of course they are making this sort of roadblock. But again, there's an element of comedy because two of them are incapacitated slightly by having young demons clutching onto them, which is not really what you want for proper warfare. And then up at the top, we have a tall demon who is giving a piggyback to a female white demon, and one can't help feeling that he's a sort of henpecked husband. He's having she's holding firmly onto his horn and obviously directing what goes on. So in together with the serious purpose in teaching of this picture about how this young man ought to behave, we have elements of comedy. Here, another picture which again I think is by Behzad. The story here is just a brief one. Sultan Sanjar has been travelling in his country, and he is stopped at one moment by an aged woman, and she clutches his garment and tells him that he's ruling very badly, the country's going to rack and ruin, people are brought up in front of the courts for no particular reason, charged with this and that. She's been accused of giving house room to a murderer, and what's he jolly well going to do about it? So one of the interesting things about this picture is that the story element is contained in this detail. That's all you need to know. King travelling, old woman. We have incidentally somebody holding his parasol and a running footman who will have cleared the way for him. But we've got a great deal more stuff going on in the upper part of the picture. And I think that the painter here has been aware of this picture, which is from nearly a century earlier. This one, also in the British Library, is in a collection of epics, and it's of 1397. And it's a different subject altogether, Mongols coming out of the mountains. But I think the painter has looked at this and sort of meditated on it and lifted some ideas. So we have the tents behind the horizon, which up to a point anyone could do. We have a mule in the midground, and mules are relatively uncommon in pictures. And the mule is associated with a white horse, and in our 1490s picture, the man has a white cape on by his mule. And then in the bottom right, which I hope isn't obscured by my head, but it may be, there is a man who is taking water from a pool with a golden vessel, and that's what we get in the middle of our picture. And even bottom left, we have a lumpy round tent and a lump of rock. So I think he's using that picture. Oops, wrong place. Then there are also in additional 25900 several pictures of the Safavid period. That's datable round about the 1520s and very probably painted in the Safavid capital of Tabriz, though it could have been painted in Herat, where the Safavids were also in power. We know it's the Safavid period because they're wearing the characteristic cap with a high point in the middle, rather like a sort of acorn cup effect over the head, and this is swathed in a white turban, which in consequence has a rather pear-shaped profile. What's happening here is that Alexander the Great, Iskander, has come to see Queen Nushabeh, but he is pretending to be his own ambassador. So Nushabeh doesn't quite buy this. She calls for a maid to bring a collection of pictures of rulers and shows him that no, he isn't an ambassador, he's Iskander, the very person himself. So there's a period of Safavid painting. Probably the earliest of the Safavid paintings in this manuscript is this one, where we are not seeing the full turban business, but we're seeing a high black and white plume on the hat, which is characteristic of, well, some early Safavid painting. Here we have Khosrow and Shirin again. Khosrow has been told about Shirin, who lives in Armenia, and he's gone off to try and find her, and she's been shown pictures of Khosrow and is travelling towards his capital to try and find him. She gets rather hot from the journey and takes a bathe in a pool. He sort of sees a lady bathing in a pool but doesn't think it's proper to take a very close look, so eventually he moves on, and the story continues with a missing and meeting and so on. Now we are in the Safavid period here because he's wearing that plume that I mentioned. His horse covering and his scabbard are treated with a great deal of ornament, rather like illumination, that we've seen as illumination, and the horse is rather plump. Safavid horses are plumper than those of the Timurid period. Here's another picture. Sorry, obviously it's another picture. What I mean to say is this is another picture of Iskander Alexander. He has been wandering through Iran. He's come on a castle which is defended by brigands, and he can't reduce this castle. So he asks where the local holy man is and is directed to him, and he goes and asks for help, and eventually the holy man just breathes out and this shatters the castle walls. So that's very suitable. I believe that this picture is by a Safavid painter called Mirza Ali. Here is a picture which Stuart Carey Welsh believes to be by Mirza Ali. It's in the great Shahnameh made for the Safavid Shah Tahmasp, with illustrations from round about the 1520s into perhaps early 30s. In this picture, Khosrow at another moment is listening to, he's being entertained as a sort of picnic effect, and a musician called Barbad is hiding in a tree and playing to him. But the things that unite these pictures are the slightly swaying chinar tree, the oriental plane, and the fact that Khosrow is again wearing a garment. I beg your pardon. Iskander is wearing a garment covered with decoration as like illumination, whereas this sort of stuff is used in the little dome over the throne for Khosrow. So there's still that sort of interest in this illumination. And then most particularly the clouds, which sweeping forward and covering a glimmering moon in both pictures. on the picture from our Khamsah on the right, there would, of course, been more trails from the clouds in the upper right, but they've been trimmed off, unfortunately, at some point. Here we go into the other manuscript, Oriental 6810. It has, at the beginning, this round circular affair called a Shamseh, or a little sun, and often these tell us who the manuscript has been made for, but this one doesn't. It's full of nice gold writing which manages to tell us practically nothing. So that's one point in its history, which will be of the 1490s, as we'll go into later. And then beside that, there are inscriptions on the left from the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, and below that from his son, the ruler Shah Jahan. So in the book, Ursula Sims-Williams of the British Library has done a big study of the inscriptions that came in the Mughal period when it went into the Mughal library, and also the seals, an example of which you see down below as well. This has a frontispiece which is very distinctly a frontispiece. The bits are meant to fit together, and we have a gentleman who is being entertained. He's got all you need, music, food, drink, a horse waiting in case he wants to go somewhere, and somebody delivering him a message. The message is excruciatingly difficult and has not been entirely read, but it appears to have a name in it. I'm not at this moment going to pursue the question of who the man is, because that's one of the problems of the manuscript, but I just want to look at the painting. You can perhaps see here that the figures have a sort of downturned moustache over a downturned mouth, and this is typical of pictures by a character called Mirah Khorasani, whose name was written on one side of the frontispiece, which I forgot to mention, but it's there nevertheless. So that is one of the painters. He's probably in charge at the beginning. Here I think we have him again. Here we have ladies, but they also have a somewhat downturned mouth, except for the beautiful Shireen in the middle. Now, Shireen is here in Armenia before she's met Khosrow. She likes enjoying herself in the mountains in freedom with her ladies, again with a bit of music and wine. And Shapur, a servant of Khosrow, has told Khosrow about her, and has gone to try and advertise Khosrow to her by pinning his picture on a tree. And before anything really takes off, he has to do this 3 times. So this is the first time Shireen is shown a picture of Khosrow, and she's looking quite relaxed. She's not yet madly in love with him, which she will be very shortly. This picture has a number of pictures of dandelions in it, which is not one of the usual flowers in Persian painting, but dandelions do occur in the frontispiece. This is one of them. Its gold head is rather sunk into the gold of the background, but I think that this is a link between this and the frontispiece. I think this is again the work of Mirak. Again, I think we have the work of Mirak, because we have gents with the downturned mouth and general look of grimness. Here we have, of course, the story of Sanjar and the old woman, and here the master, Mirak, has put it in its simplest form, whereas probably a few years earlier, in roughly 1490, whereas the Mirak one is about 1495, we had his pupil, Behzad, doing it with bells and whistles. I think possibly the old man is actually trying to show that this is the proper way to do it. In the Behzad picture, the ruler Sanja is wearing the green colour typical for the ruler of the time, Hossein Baikara, and perhaps the young painter wants to say that things flourish under his rule, because at the top we've got flocks and merchant and things going on quite nicely. Perhaps the older man has a clearer idea of how these things work, because he has not painted his Sanja to look like the current ruler, which is perhaps a good thing, since the old woman is ticking him off. in the earlier picture. So I think this is Behzad reworking himself. Here we have a picture again, I think attributable to him. This is in the story of Khosrow and Shireen. A sculptor come civil engineer by the name of Farhad has been commissioned to make a road through the mountains and to make a channel through the mountains for milk from the flocks in the mountains to be brought to Shireen in her castle. But he falls in love with her. Khosrow, who sort of loves Shireen, but at the moment is in a moment of separation from her, hears that Farhad has fallen in love with her and becomes deadly jealous. He sends an evil man to give Farhad false news of the death of Layla, and Farhad throws himself down from the mountain and dies. So here we have Farhad, a beautiful picture. His head has been crashed open, but he has this look of calm, so that you feel that he has, he's at peace. He's followed his love. He's still attached to a world where love is the most important thing. And here we have the evil man who has given this false news, who is perhaps feeling his guilt, and he's wrestling with himself with guilt. And these are two figures who are particularly characteristic of the great humanity of Behzad and his moral concerns. Here we have another picture which you'll recognize as being Bahram Gur fighting the dragon. Here I think we are definitely by another painter. On the left in the earlier manuscript, Behzad. On the right, I think Qasim Ali. There is a note attributing the picture written in the text, between the text lines below the picture. And I think Qasim Ali is not at home with this vigorous action picture. It's not his thing. Whereas Bahram Gour's horse Behzad is charging forward, for Qasim Ali, the horse is more or less prancing on the spot. And the dragon seems to be reduced. One doesn't feel it so long. Its neck doesn't have the muscular effect, and its head is frankly rather furry. Then there's the curious fact that instead of the female onager, he has introduced a picture of a harpist lady. This in this story is Fetneh, who will be a companion of Bahram Gour when he hunts, but not at this stage. It's when he has come to rule, and here this is before he's ruling, when he's just a boy, well, a young man. So it's not entirely clear to me whether the painter decided or didn't know that Fetneh didn't came into this picture, or if he wanted to demonstrate that he was better off at this sort of painting than at animals and action. Anyway, two characteristics of his are in the tawny yellow colour of the ground and some lights of a rather turquoise colour in the rock. We see these again in this picture. This is a man called Bishr who has been travelling, and his companion has been a rather bad freethinker who has decided to take a dip in a waterhole which has been provided for animals. And he has in fact drowned, and Bishr is trying to dig him out. So it is a picture of action, but it's rather a still, arrested action in a way. One sees the pose of the man digging the other out of the waterhole, a kneeling posture, and we have this nice chinar tree sweeping in from the side. That we also get in this picture, again attributed to Qasim Ali, the same, not quite the same shape of chinar tree, but something like. And we have Layla and Majnun at school when they first fall in love. You can see Layla very clearly because of the emphasis of her orange-red garment. And though everybody in the school is doing things, there is, I would suggest, again, this sense of arrested motion. Here we have a picture, again, attributed to Qasim Ali between the bits of text of the top right. We have, in the lower area, in shadow, Majnun, who has come to the tomb of Layla because he's died, he's been told of this. He's come and he is embracing the tomb. We are in shadow of sadness and death, but the stream, which would have been more silvery, is flanked by flowers which are indicative of their love and of something which in a way will continue beyond death. Above that we have fairly ordinary life with flocks and herds, ladies chatting and spinning. We also have this interesting man who is looking out over the horizon. He's blowing a pipe, which may be clear. We have above it a little note saying this is the work of Qasim Ali. That's one of the ones you can perhaps read. Ursula Sims-Williams kindly pointed out to me that the orthography is a little unusual since the line of Arabic ends with a vav, which is not really necessary. So that is perhaps, it's an interesting thing which links the pictures in this, the attributions in this manuscript. Now, here we have yet another story. It's one of the stories told to Bahram Gour by a fleet of princesses that he has installed when he comes to rule. Here a young man owns a garden, and he wants to visit it one day, but is prevented by a couple of female guards who march him off and put him in a tower from which he can see a lot of ladies enjoying themselves in his pool, and he is obliged to watch them. He will, in fact, fall in love with a harpist lady who one can see in the middle right. He is watching from the window. You can just see him, his eye peeping out. You can see his fingers nervously clutching at the side of the window blind. So he's watching. I mean, it's difficult to believe that he could see that harpist from there, but that is not the point of the picture. Now, above the white turban of the man in the window, you can probably see some marks. And if one puts them on their side, it gives the name Qasim Ali. So I think that's very clearly an indication that certainly in this picture, he's trying to smuggle his name in. So he's felt that he has been overlooked. Perhaps that's what he was saying in the previous picture with the man with the pipe whose face is turned away. Here I think we're again Qasim Ali, though I think it has been often attributed to Besard. We have that Chinar which flows in from the right. We have again Iskander visiting the holy man to ask what he should do about the brigands, and this time we see the castle and we see this wonderful rockscape leading up to it, which has some of this turquoise shading, which is perhaps one of the facets of the rock style of Qasim Ali. The figure of Iskander is here. It is done in a way which is clearly meant to reflect the ruler of the time, Hossein Baikara. So again, we're in the 1490s, probably intended, well, certainly intended, I think, to represent the ruler, wearing the turquoise green colour, which is characteristic of him, and elegantly posed. Here, a picture which is generally considered to be by Besard, Hossein Baikara in the guise of Iskander, Alexander in consultation with his 7 philosophers who are telling him about the origins of life and its meaning. So it's a very important, solemn scene, and it's important. It's one of the biggest pictures, and it is the one which carries the date, which here is 1490, which is what gives us the 1495 date, which I've perhaps been mentioning on the way. So this is the picture of the person in charge of the paintings at this time. And here is his Hossein Baikara, listening intently to the philosophers. Now, if we compare these two figures, they've got a lot that's the same, but I think essentials that are different, which is why I think it's 2 different painters. On the left, we have the elegant figure, upright, speaking gesture. Both of them have a turban whose frill ends with little white dots. Both of them solemn and in charge. But the man on the right is a little older, and he has a little more physicality, even with the relative flatness of Persian painting, the lines indicating bulk, and even the outlines indicating bulk, make him a little plumper. So we've gone a little closer to naturalism, though the paintings will have been done at the same time. I think they're both working from what you might call the same model conception, but I don't think these can be by the same painter. So I think at the end of this manuscript, Behzad is in charge, and here is a final picture where Iskander, again in the, or rather, Hossein Baikara, the ruler, celebrated as though he were Iskander, Alexander. He's beating the drum on a talisman, which is something he has built as a sort of protective object, because at this point, if your ship gets into this area, it gets caught in a whirlpool and breaks up. But beating the talisman protects the ship. So I think this final picture is a sort of tribute to the king, done in the most tactful way possible, showing him as the protector of his country. Thank you.